Thanks, everybody, and really honored to be a part of this. Joel Lobenstein, lead our tribal services practice based out of Austin, Texas here. And personally, just a real quick background on myself, been involved in renewables for going on 20 years now, first as a developer. So I've lived the development side of things. And then I lived through a financial crisis, which resulted in me going to the advisory side of things. Getting a paycheck every 2 weeks instead of trying to develop a project in the midst of a financial crisis at that time seemed like a good career trajectory. And somewhere along the way, started working with a lot of tribal governments on their energy situation, and just determined, 10 years or so ago that that's what I wanted to do and wanted to focus on. So built out a team to help tribes in that regard. And, Sherry alluded to this earlier, and I'll just echo it. I never thought when this legislation passed, and it came very quickly. There were some whispers of it in the Build Back Better legislation that got trimmed to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And when this came about in August and came together, like I said, very, very quickly, this is something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. So we do a lot and have done a lot over the past 10 years of feasibility studies, and we'd get to the end of it and there'd be gaps, and there'd be, well, can we fill that gap with a tax credit? Can we, how do we somehow get this project over the hump? And more often than not, you kind of got stuck. And now that feasibility study gets put on the shelf and collects a bunch of dust. And I think the group here today is to communicate what is going to be the case going forward, hopefully for the next decade is you can dust those feasibility studies off now. And, very, very, very few projects out there with the advent specifically of the direct pay provisions that I'm going to talk about shouldn't find a way or a path in conjunction with Loan Programs Office, some of the programs at DOE to get to the finish line. So beyond excited about that. A lot of what I'm going to present kind of either rehashes what's been put on the screen previously by DOE or maybe dives in a little deeper. But I'll just get into it, and hopefully there's some good questions, hopefully most which I can answer as we kind of go along here. So thank you very much. So IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, I think it was signed into law middle of August. It's a healthy 728 pages. The first thing I did when I got a download of the act is did a search on a few keywords that are near and dear to all of our hearts. And within the act, tribal is referenced a mere 32 times, Indian is referenced a mere 49 times, and environmental justice, which is a term we hear more and more about as it ties to tribal communities, is referenced 11 times. So all that to say is it's a massive piece of legislation and goes well beyond Indian country, but there is a very high focus of the of the part of the legislation as it relates to Indian country. So that was very exciting to me, and I guess take note is the summary there. So there's over 70 available tax credits within the IRA. Almost all of these are entitlement. In other words, you don't have to apply for them. If you do take certain action, you get the credit. There are a few competitive ones, non-entitlement ones. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Most of these credits are good, as some of the other speakers stated, through 2032. So, we've never had a runway like this, and that's challenged the renewables industry, quite frankly, that we've a lot of times had to start, stop, different policy, different administration, government gridlock, et cetera. This provides a phenomenal runway. As everybody knows, projects of this nature, particularly when they're projects, when you're not in the business of developing them or it's a one-time project, take time. So we've got a bit of a runway. There's certain actions that and information that I think tribes need to be aware of now, but this is something that you've got time to plan for, which is very, very exciting. In terms of the timeline, upon execution of the legislation, what I call the prior regime of credits, the credits were restored to their full value from now to the end of the year. I think that's important, but much more relevant is what happens starting in 2023. And that is this idea of direct pay credits and this idea of bonus credits on those direct pay and everything that can do there. And going forward, there's a transition, but it fundamentally doesn't change how the credit impacts a given project. And I'm not going to get into the details and nuances of that, but 2023 is really when the fund begins. But there may be certain actions you want to take this year, or certain things you may want to consider yet this year as this starts to roll out. Just a few of the credits, a few of the areas of technology that are applied, existing credits that were already here with adders or enhanced features, wind, solar, hydro, call it traditional stuff, biomass, trash, which is the tax code's way of saying waste to energy. So like an anaerobic digester type project, combined heat and power, that's CHP, carbon capture, renewable fuels, waste oil to diesel fuel, those sorts of things, biodiesel. Those are all credits that already existed that just got put on steroids through this act, if you will. And then there's some new credits, qualifying biogas, a solar production tax credit, where historically there was only a solar investment tax credit available. Huge emphasis on electric vehicles. Battery storage, you've probably heard more than you can imagine on hydrogen and the opportunity and promise of clean hydrogen going into the future. So a lot of new pieces that are very exciting to kind of see roll out, see what the impacts are in the market, that sort of thing. So combination of enhancement of old credits and a whole bunch of new credits that are going to present a whole bunch of opportunity. And again, we talked about direct pay. So, we're going to get into some of the details of that here. The overriding theme of direct pay, other than the fact that when you build a project as a tribal government now and file a tax return with the IRS, you are going to get a check for a certain percentage of that project back after you file your taxes in the subsequent tax year that you place the project in service. The bonus criteria is really an interesting thing that I don't think anybody really saw coming. And again, we talked about that, where meeting prevailing wage and apprenticeship is a big one. That gives you the initial boost on an investment tax credit basis to get to that 30%. The domestic content, we'll talk about the definition of that in a bit, just at a high level. Another 10%. Energy community, previous speakers spoke to that, and it had a great map kind of displaying what that's going to look like potentially. Another 10%, and then these environmental justice credits, which can get you the 10% or 20%. One thing not to overlook is with production tax credits, you get the equivalent bump on an annual basis for that tax credit regime if you're electing, and in many credit cases, you can elect either an investment tax credit or a production-based tax credit. So the bonus or the juice essentially is the same. It just increases it by a percentage and is over time versus upfront. And I'll get into a comparison of ITC versus PTC in a subsequent slide as well. Prevailing wage. This is a big deal because it gives you, again, that 30% boost. If you meet prevailing wage, which is essentially federal or what is still to be determined, and I would encourage tribes, to the extent this is meaningful, to submit comments, tribal prevailing wage. If those are met, you get a 5 times bonus, which equates to a 30% on an investment tax credit basis versus a 6%, in addition to certain requirements around apprenticeship. That's important. That's makes a world of difference when we're talking about this, and in almost all the analysis we run, we assume folks are going to meet that. I'm not here to advocate whether or not you should meet that, want to meet that, choose to meet it. But there is a provision that's very, very important in that there's going to be guidance around prevailing wage that hasn't come out yet. When that guidance comes out, any project that meets a begun construction requirement within 60 days or 59 days of that guidance is essentially safe harbored into this prevailing wage apprenticeship requirement. In other words, you're never going to be audited on whether or not you met it or not. You don't have to meet it. You can choose to meet it. And many of you may want to meet that, because I think it's generally a good thing to meet prevailing wage. And maybe your provisions as a tribal government already have that condition met in how you operate. But the point being, it's one less thing that you would have to comply with. So that's very, very important to understand. And This applies, the prevailing wage provision applies to all projects greater than 1 megawatt. So if you're doing a smaller project, less than 1 megawatt, in all cases, you don't have to worry about prevailing wage. But if you're doing a larger project, and whether or not you may or may not want to meet prevailing wage, you should just know that there is going to be, or there's an opportunity to just purely not have to deal with that compliance. And that's by meeting this concept of begun construction. And begun construction, I'm not going to get into too many of the details, but it goes way, way back into the tax code when we were only dealing with non-direct pay and production and investment tax credits, and it was always tied to locking in your tax credit more than locking in, not having to deal with prevailing wage. But the language around it, we believe, is going to remain the same. And it's essentially physical work of a significant nature, either on-site or off-site. And there's a very specific way that is required to meet that contractually, but it's not as difficult as you might think. The simplest answer or example I like to give is, let's say you're looking to develop a solar project, and physical work of an on-site nature might be you're just putting in a foundation for the racking that's essential to the project. And one foundation under contract can potentially meet that begun construction requirement. Or you engage in on let's say $1 million project, you engage with a $50,000 contract for certain components that would go into that solar project. By entering into that contract in the right way, with certain provisions, you can meet that begun construction. So that's all the further I'm going to go into it. I think it's one thing that if you haven't kind of lived in this crazy tax credit world for the last decade plus, it might get overlooked. But there are going to be, with all these great incentives and opportunities, a lot of compliance requirements and audit risk that come with it. This is just one way, if you're on the verge of or contemplating a project, to strategically think about one less compliance component to have to worry about over a 5-year period from when the project starts construction to when it gets to when that compliance period burns off. So I'll leave begun construction at that, but something to note if you weren't aware of those provisions. So let's talk about the good stuff, the adders. Domestic content, we talked about, again, getting that 30% to 40%. Once again, this does not apply to projects less than 1 megawatt. So if you're doing a smaller project, you're not likely to have to worry about it. If you're doing a project larger than that, what does domestic content actually mean? And we could have an entire webinar on domestic content provisions, probably. All the steel and iron that you put into the project has to be sourced or sourced from the United States. And then 40% of what's defined as manufactured projects initially. And that 40% goes up over time. I don't have the exact schedule within this PowerPoint, but it is available. But initially 40% of the manufactured projects or components that go into the project have to be sourced domestically. So there's a whole heck of a lot more devil in the details as we see it now, and additional guidance certainly will be coming out. But something again to note, if you're developing a project larger than 1 megawatt, the energy community aspect we talked about here. Yes.
Can I interrupt you for a moment for a question related to that domestic content that I think would be pertinent to answer now?
Certainly.
From our friend Maggie Talmadge. There's I've heard this a couple of times now, and is it true that intent but tribes cannot?
Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, you were breaking up a little, Sherry.
So Maggie has asked, I was under the impression that for-profit companies can apply for a waiver of the domestic content requirement, but tribes cannot. Can you please clarify?
I'm not familiar with application of such waiver. And again, the 728 pages of legislation have knocked me on my back. So I am familiar with certain provisions where if you can demonstrate that by having to meet domestic content, either the supply chain isn't available locally to meet that provision, or it's caused your project to increase in cost by 25% or more, you can get a waiver. That is my understanding of the waiver provisions. It may go beyond that, and I don't know, or I'm not familiar with any nexus of a not-for-profit or for-profit. Maybe there's others on the call that are, but we can certainly, and this brings up a good point with any of these great questions, follow up with a response to those that we either don't have a exact confident answer to today, or we just don't get to. So, but those are the provisions, to my understanding, where that domestic content requirement can be waived, and that it's tied to either supply chain challenges, or it just makes your project so much more expensive that it's cost prohibitive to meet them.
Okay, great. And Maggie, real quick, you're correct. The Energy Justice Bonus Credit is limited to projects that are 5 megawatt or smaller, 1.8 gigawatt per year limit. All right, Joel, continue. Energy community. Sorry to
Great.
interrupt.
No, please continue as questions arise and are relevant to these slides. That's a great question. So yes, energy communities. I look forward to the day when Treasury or someone, and we're racing, I think DOE might be racing. There's a lot of entities racing to try to build these cool interactive mapping tools where you can just type in an address and it'll go to your census tract and it'll tell you I'm a brownfield, I'm tied to coal, oil, or natural gas, or I'm a location where a coal mine or power plant have closed or adjacent to that. Those are all going to be coming. A lot of folks are speculating. In some instances, you can definitely determine it now, right? You know, if it's a brownfield or some of these other provisions, but it is anticipated again that tool of some sort will be released, and definitive guidance will come out about whether or not your project is in an energy community, and that is a 10% bonus that applies across any and all technologies. We're going to talk about the environmental justice bonus in a bit, which is a little different in terms of technology applicability, and is again a substantial benefit. And as we look at some of the preliminary maps, it's amazing about the portion of the country that is going to be covered by this energy community is substantial. I mean, almost the entirety of Alaska and California, or a lot of California, which represents, a substantial number of tribal governments, as we all know, and a lot of other areas that you wouldn't otherwise think of as energy communities. So I think a lot of folks are in for hopefully a pleasant surprise when they realize, their project is now eligible for, say, 50% versus 40% if they've met domestic content. So very exciting. More to come on that. Stay tuned. And again, I know as a firm, we're going to build a mapping tool around it that will complement whatever formal tool comes out. And it should get a lot easier, hopefully very, very soon, to determine by specific address whether or not you sit in an energy community.
Okay, that's wonderful. We've gotten questions, and Wendelin pointed out, the map that Dr. Elise showed was mostly coal communities and nuclear communities, questions about that. So folks, stay tuned, and we'll give you some resources at the end to websites to keep looking at for that new guidance.
Yep, we're as eager as anyone, and it's not definitive yet, so it's hard to plan on it, but for certain cases. So let's talk about more adders. We kind of got to, in the back of our mind, 50% via the last slide with prevailing wage gets us to 30, domestic content gets us to 40. Hopefully we're in a clean energy community that gets us to 50. Now what's left? It's for two specific technologies only, and that's important to note. Up to 5 megawatts, wind and solar are eligible for an additional 10 or 20%. And that's the slides that my colleague at the DOE had up previously, which is, just focused again for the purpose of this group, located on Indian land. You're going to get a 10% additional credit, or you are eligible for, I should rephrase that because that's very important. You're eligible to apply for a 10% additional credit, or if it provides a certain amount of benefit to low-income communities, households, that can get you as high as 20%. One critical distinction, and there was some confusion about this, at least in my mind, maybe within the last month, but I think there's a pretty strong consensus now, is that you can't take both. It's an either or. So by default, the project status is being located on Indian land, and the definition goes back to EPACT. I'm not an attorney, but it's relatively intuitive in terms of that definition. And we could certainly provide that again as one of our follow-ups is you get that 10%. But if you're let's say a community solar project, quote unquote, less than 5 megawatts, and you're tying that community solar project back to a housing development within your reservation, and the savings from that project are at least 50% of them are going to offset the power bills of those housing, you could be eligible for 20% as an example. The thing to note here with this adder, it's not an entitlement like the prior two adders. The domestic content and energy community, if you check those boxes, you are entitled to that additional bonus. With these, you are going to have to apply for them. The process by which has not been promulgated. It's not clear yet. That's part of this, getting the comments back to IRS, Treasury, et cetera, on how these may be considered. But there's an allocation, and that allocation is 1,800 megawatts per year for 2023 and 2024 that will be allocated to these types of projects that fit this criteria. How they're going to decide who gets them if they are oversubscribed is very much to be determined at this time. For reference, I just did some quick math as I was putting this together, like how many projects less than 5 megawatts is 1,800 megawatts? Well, if you were doing as many 5 megawatts projects as you could, it's 720 different projects a year. Half of that is, almost 1,500 projects. So while it's a healthy amount of projects, you're competing with everyone else for these credits. When I say you, the tribal community, Indian country, tribal governments, this isn't just a tribal set aside. It's just by nature of being on Indian land, you are automatically eligible under that 10% to apply. So that's about all we know as a firm about that process. It's just very important to note when we start talking about and getting excited about that example previously about $1 million project that could get a $700,000 direct pay rebate. That's awesome. But there may be situations where only 500,000 of that, if you're in a clean energy community and use domestic content, is really you can bank on as we sit here today. The rest you're going to have to, via some sort of process that we don't know how it's going to get rolled out, apply for. And this is a first of its kind. So it's really anybody's guess, and we can speculate a lot, but it's kind of a wait and see right now. And, to the extent you have relationships in Washington, providing comments on, perhaps they will come out with further guidance where they're going to carve some of that 1,800 out for tribal projects or projects on Indian land. Is that possible? Absolutely. But it's just very much to be determined at this point.
Joel, is there a minimum size project on the less than 5 megawatt?
There's no minimum, no minimum. And I would suggest if I'm Treasury or IRS, and I'm not, you may be in better shape with the smaller project. I don't know how they're going to score these. It'll be very interesting to see if it's first come, first serve, starting at a certain date, if they're going to take other economic criteria into consideration, if they're going to take, we've seen every and any kind of formulaic exercise done by the government from CARES Act to the American Rescue Plan to now Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so it's really hard to say, but certainly there is no, at this point, no minimum project size to get in line and try to obtain this additional bonus. And I suspect and hope that the application process is fairly straightforward and easy. But to be sure, they will have to come up with some sort of criteria. The other provision to note is if you do get this bonus, you have 4 years to complete the project, which is a healthy runway. But just note that they're going to require you to demonstrate progress, and they want to see this bonus result in projects getting done. So 4 years from what exact date, but just assume 4 years from the time you're awarded the bonus in whatever process they determine to get the project done. So the famous credit stack, I don't think mine looks as good as the prior DOE in my black and white slide, but just to reiterate again, everything we've been kind of blabbing about here, that ITC with the labor requirements met, and if you meet begun construction within 60 days, of the forthcoming guidance, you're automatically deemed to have met those labor requirements. You get that 30%. That's the most important thing. Domestic content, you very much under your control. That's probably second most important in my mind, again, because you control it. So that gets you to 40. The energy community, you have a little less control over to get you to 50. And then the either or, again, of Indian land or this qualified low-income building project or economic benefit project that you could go after a 10%, or depending on the nature of your project, a 20% direct pay. So extremely excited. Call it, there'll be a lot of terms for this. I initially called it the Holy Grail. It's, it's going to be very exciting and very interesting to see how competitive indeed that 1,800 megawatt per year 2023 2024 pool is. I suspect it will be extremely. I suspect you're going to have a lot of call it professional developers trying to potentially line up 5 megawatt projects on the back of each other to do what would have otherwise been a 100 megawatt project, but now they're going to say, hey, we got to, and I think there's going to be some logic from Treasury, IRS's, side to try to avoid those projects getting awarded. One would intuitively think, but your mind goes to all the different permutations of what you could do with this, and for the benefit of tribes as well. If you're looking at a larger scale project that you might want to try to carve up to take advantage of this healthy subsidy. So,
which is a caveat for tribal representatives listening, that if you're being approached by developers about doing something like that, always put in a call to Office of Indian Energy or our friends at Baker Tilly or any one of the folks here on the call to make sure that that's going to fly before you invest time and money and heart in conversations like that.
Absolutely. So just a quick what I call back of the napkin, we're an accounting firm. I'm not an accountant or what they call a bean counter in the profession, but we got a lot of people, myself included, that like to run scenarios and run numbers. And what you see here, if you haven't seen something like this before, is what we call a sensitivity table. And what I tried to do, just for quick discussion purposes, to put a little more, call it meat on the bones of what these bonus credits can do for a project, is I took just a basic solar project financial model, and I assumed that it was a 1 megawatt project and it cost about $1.6 million and had a 20% capacity factor. If everyone on this call is familiar with capacity factor, that's basically how much the sun's going to shine in a 24-hour day, how much the energy is going to be produced at full capacity of the system. And I assumed a power sale to the grid, or let's say you're offsetting power at 6 cents, which depending on the area of the country you're in might be way, way low, or it might be way, way high. California or Alaska versus, say, Oklahoma. But what I did was kind of take, this bottom line here, if you can see that project cost on the x-axis here of 1.58 million. This is what this project before IRA would have taken 14 years to pay itself back. And for a solar project that's creating renewable power and a hedge against fossil fuel and is maybe a 30-year asset, that's not terrible. I would argue, but if you look here to our friendly ITC's kind of inverse stacking chart, if I have domestic content and I meet prevailing wage, that project is now an 8-year payback. If I'm in an energy community on top of it, that project pays back in 7 years. If I'm in Indian land and I apply and are awarded a bonus for environmental justice, it's a 6-year. And if I'm a community benefit project that gets a 20% bonus to get my total up to 70, that's a 4-year payback. A 4-year payback on a 25, 30-year asset that is only offsetting, relatively, I would say, low cost of power. So this is what all this stuff we're talking about today, to me, kind of comes back to and gets me beyond excited is we go from essentially a base level from a 14-year payback to an 8-year payback. And if we can get we'll call it the Holy Grail, or we got to think of a better term for that, of all bonus, we're going to get, a 4-year payback on a solar project is just unprecedented. So very, very exciting. Hopefully this makes sense. It's a lot of different numbers, but you know, if you get the slides as a follow-up and have further questions, feel free to reach out. But this kind of shows, you know, that dynamic. And even at I'll just go to one more example and I'll get off this slide, but you know, at 3.4 cents, if we look to our sensitivity table, if we got the 70%, we're still paying back in 8 years at 3.4 cent solar power. You know, that's amazing. So hopefully that
It is amazing.
kind of demonstrates what can be achieved here. And we're not even getting into some of the opportunities that Matt's going to talk about with LPO and cheap debt that you can layer in and all the fun stuff that comes with structuring these projects. So really excited about that. Another thing I wanted to point out, totally unrelated to the infrastructure or the IRA, is you might be sitting there saying, well, that's cool. This all sounds exciting. I don't have, you know, a bunch of money sitting around to either start assessing that or maybe even implementing. And I want to make sure everyone's aware, because a lot of our tribal clients haven't been, with all the different funding coming out, is there is a current opening of Department of Energy formula grants. And formula grant, all that means is every tribe gets one. Every tribe is allocated between $30,000 and $2.1 million. Some of you on this call, if you're affiliated with tribal government, should be familiar with this. If you're not, look up this IIJA section 40101D DOE formula grants. And those grants are for anything related to grid resiliency. So while they're not exclusively tied to every given generation project, if your project is tied to grid resiliency, battery storage, backup generators, those sorts of things, those dollars were out there. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I wanted to point that out, that I had an audience, because I don't think this program, with all the other programs that are out there, has gotten the attention it really deserves. It's a simple application. You apply and you get the dollar amount, and it is known what dollar amount you get. And by the way, this is a 5-year program. So once you apply, you're going to get funding every year for the next 5 years in an amount allocated based on this formula. So not related to IRA, but could indirectly help you kind of kickstart whatever it is you might be looking at. And it's something you can go get right now.
Okay. We are almost done even with Q&A time, Joel.
Okay.
We're way over. If you could pick out the things that are most important for you to convey, let's go there.
Let's just wrap it up. Thank you for interrupting, and apologize for going over. It's not the first time and won't be the last.
All good stuff. No worries.
No, I'll just wrap it up, because I've got some more time at the back end that I'll probably go over with as well. But you know, again, just things to think about. If you're saying, well, that's great, I can get 50% of it, but I still need the other 50%. You know, there's going to be a lot of opportunity with the Loan Programs Office, with traditional lenders and other funding sources to chase down that additional 50% by, you know, that bridge loan concept, where if you were able to get 100% financing, 50% of it might get paid back within 18 months. So very exciting. That was the only point of some additional considerations on this slide. Is don't think you're not going to be able to do your project just because that credit matrix isn't at 100%. There's going to be there are a lot of other options, to include the Department of Energy grant funding that we heard about previously. So just something to be aware. Yes.
Is there any restriction? We had a question in the chat. Is there any restriction on the direct pay? So I would assume the answer is no, since it's a refund. It's basically a tax refund, but unless you have different information.
It is unrestricted dollars, absolutely. So
Sweet.
Nothing to worry about there. Great question, though. It is in theory federal money, but it is unrestricted federal money. So there's some interesting strategies around that for tribes that we don't need to get into. I'm past time, but yeah, I just wanted to know, don't just write this off because you can't figure out how to get the other pieces to the puzzle. There's a lot of other tools in the toolbox that we've discussed, and from there, I'll stop there. I was going to do a quick plug for combined heat and power, but maybe if there's time at the end, we can do that. So
CHP.
I'm biased against CHP because I think it's some of the lowest hanging fruit out there, but
Agreed.
conversation for another day. Sorry for
Uh,
going over time. I'll pause
no.
there.